I commend these bills to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, can I thank the Minister? And in this bill has bipartisan support. In fact, I don't believe, maybe there is, but I don't believe there's a party in the Parliament that's opposed to it for logical and common sense reasons. Can I also thank him for the way he's conducted himself in respect of transacting this report. I think the committee across the House has done a pretty good job to come to grips with it. We will support the bill. This is an admirable bill. It's necessary in respect of all the things we've debated tonight over and over as we sort of head towards midnight in terms of appropriate accounting and financial reporting standards, transparency, accountability, et al. I want to particularly say that we on this side believe that reducing unnecessary compliance costs, especially for small entities, but all entities, is appropriate. I well recall being Minister for Small Business for a time in the last government, and the dilemma for, a bit like the building and construction ministers, I think, there's a decent alumni of SME ministers past and present in this place, and with cabinets with all good intentions, when ministers attempt to reduce compliance cost, they have colleagues around them in other portfolios who, again, for the best intentions, are trying to solve other problems, and in doing so often can put those compliance costs or pile them back on, again, in good faith. But I will say this Minister has acted in a far more effective way than the then Minister of Small Business, the Honourable, use that word advisedly, John Archibald Banks, whose greatest contribution to the body politic was to stand in this House, I think, last year or within the last 12 months and promote a piece of legislation that had at its heart getting rid of 31 spent acts. And for the uninitiated, I had to ask the clerk, because I was, a spent act is effectively an act that in all essence has been repealed and in essence has no effect on anybody, it doesn't exist. So he was sort of repealing 31 acts that have no effect on anybody. That was the Honourable John Archibald Banks's great high point as Minister of SMEs before he got into a high degree of difficulty involving his second court appearance after being convicted in a previous life of a criminal offence elsewhere. So he's rather preoccupied with his own compliance costs, and I suspect there might be a few more compliance costs as he heads through the court proceeding trying to defend the indefensible, sir. So in terms of transparency and standards, I hope Minister Foss might perhaps lend Minister Banks or former Minister Banks give him some advice on how to maintain high standards of accountability and transparency, possibly in his own personal affairs, for which he is now accountable before the courts, and that may lead to some lifelong learning for Mr Banks as he contemplates doing other things, as he looks perhaps through striped sunshine in the next few years. Sir, I'm particularly grateful for the clarification around charities. I do take the point, and I think a number of colleagues made it, that of course the more appropriate level of financial reporting and the more openness and transparency and accountability a charity can have, though it is somewhat burdensome to make any changes, I do hope, as the Minister does, will promote further giving from people because they have a greater confidence that the charitable dollar which they're donating will be used, as it generally is in 99% of cases, in an appropriate way and get to those who are in need, either medically or because of their personal circumstances, that the money gets to where it needs to go to assist people. I do come back to a couple of the points I made previously, and I do say to the government again, even though we are supporting this, that they ought to look to their own conduct in terms of when they are promoting standards and accountability and transparency. I've just touched on in a previous speech the rather shoddy, slipshod and totally morally wrong way in which they dealt with the provision for sale and loss of dividends from the mixed ownership model. I just say again to them, it will be difficult for some as they read this and are required to spend quite a bit of money in many respects to make the relevant changes, and then they look at the government's own record of accounting standards, aided and abetted in this case, I have to say, sadly, by the Treasury, who allowed this behaviour to be got away with. They may look at this government and say, well, you know, if it's good enough for us, why isn't it good enough for you? As in the government, sir, not you, the Speaker. Because I think the behaviour has been reprehensible. It was done simply for political purposes. And sadly, the government ought to realise that you don't actually need a piece of legislation in some ways to be accountable, because New Zealand is a small village. Everybody knows what everybody is doing. And the people saw through that act of incompetence, negligence, and an act that was completely wrong. They've now seen through that as we've gone through several botched mixed ownership model sales. People aren't silly. This government ought to sort of work that out. They know when they're being snowed, they know when there's a snow job, and they know when one is trying to be put across them. So I say that. That also goes, sir, in terms of standards and transparency, to some of the other deals. Bizarre negotiations like Rio Tinto, done behind closed doors, no explanations, no claims about job security, and that's why they paid 30 million pieces of silver to Rio Tinto on a claim that they were securing jobs for Southland. And I know, without bringing the Speaker into the debate, I know he's a very parochial Southlander, stands up for his patch very well, but the commitment was made, he's a hunter indeed, and the commitment was made in this House that $30 million effectively bought job security for those Rio Tinto workers. And we now know two things: that before the ink was dry on the cheque, on the Tuesday, in the Southland Times, Rio was already announcing the fact that they were laying off maintenance workers. We now know. What's this got to do, and Tolly says, with the bill? Well, that says it all. You know, a day late and $1 short from that one over there. It's about, Ms Tolley, accountability, transparency and walking the talk. When you promote a bill that requires a high level of financial reporting, accountability and transparency for others, one would think you'd do that from a position of moral authority, where you could stand up and say, I or the government are going to adhere to the same standard. That, Ms Tolley, is what it's all about. And as I was saying, the Rio deal, claim made, of course, that $30 million, well, she still doesn't get it, but that's right. Get Nick Smith to explain it to you out the back over a coffee afterwards. You know, if Ms Tolley doesn't know what it's about, that says a lot to the community, doesn't it? That says a lot. Ignorance for that member is bliss, absolute bliss. Hear no evil, see no evil. The facts are that $30 million was promised to secure jobs, and then we find out that the Minister of Finance didn't even ask for a jobs guarantee. Now, he may not have got one, fair enough, but he didn't even have the brains, the gumption or the professionalism to ask for that, sir. Or the Chorus deal, no transparency in that. No transparency, no accountability. The Solid Energy deal, asleep at the wheel. No accountability, no transparency, and some pretty dodgy financial reporting standards in amongst there. Oh, they've woken up. I say to those members opposite that if they're going to apply this sort of legislation, which is appropriate to everybody else, they might want to look at their own financial conduct, their own conduct in respect of SOEs, Chorus, the Sky City deal, and ask themselves the Ruatanaka Dam project that minister is involved in various surreptitious ways, and say maybe we should have the same level of openness and accountability and transparency and standards. That, Ms Tolley, is what it's all about. Walking the talk, practising what you preach, and not being, well, I can't use the H word, of course, sir, but not saying one thing and demanding that people outside this chamber adhere to high standards of accountability and professionalism and reporting and transparency. But, oh, that's okay for them, the plebs outside here, says the government, but it's not okay for us. We'll set our own standards, we'll lower the height bar as we see fit, and anything will go. So I say in conclusion, sir, we support the tenure of this bill. We support it, as there's a bit of a verbal biffo going on across the House, sir, between a couple of members, but that's okay. We're getting close to the bewitching hour, and I'm sure there'll be a few broomsticks flying out of here from time to time, sir. But I say we support this legislation. It has bipartisan support, but I just wish the government would actually look at it and say, OK, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us.
Jonathan Young.
Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased to stand and commend this bill to the House.
Mr Speaker.
David Clark.
Mr Speaker, let's see if I can outlast the chair of the committee who